Hello, and welcome to the People's AI, presented by Vana. I'm your host, Jeff Wilser, and I am delighted to be joined today by one of the smartest investors in the world of Web3 AI, Jake Brukhman. And I am also delighted to partner with Vana to bring this podcast to you. Vana's vision is user-owned AI through user-owned data, and their mission is to be the world's first open protocol for data sovereignty. And Jake's mission, broadly speaking, is to support and invest smartly and shrewdly in this space. Now, if you've been in the crypto world for a minute, Jake Brukhman needs no introduction. His firm, CoinFund, was founded in 2015. It was one of the very first crypto-native investment firms. And now Jake is very focused on the intersection of AI and Web3. His Twitter handle now even says DAI Summer. And as he explains in our conversation, he has a theory as to why the next few months will see an explosion of activity. This episode, honestly, is stuffed with alpha. Jake and I cover a lot of ground in the crypto AI space, from the most promising use cases to his investing thesis to red flags and green flags he looks for in investing. Think of it as sitting down with a glass of wine with one of the savviest investors in the space and picking his brain for what he likes, what he doesn't like. Now, hashtag not financial advice, obviously, but I think it is super helpful context for perspective for anyone. We also explore an inherent paradox in investing in decentralized AI, that much of its tech is open source and transparent, but typically early stage investors want to see a moat or basically a way to make money. Jake kind of explores and reconciles this seeming paradox. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Jake Brukhman, founder and CEO of CoinFund. Jake, welcome to the People's AI.
Hi, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
So let's start big picture. When you look at the intersection of AI and crypto right now, like what excites you the most? What's the killer use case that actually makes sense?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think a lot of the stuff in this space is really focused on, it's very like zoomed in on various features. Like people talk about inference, they talk about GPU aggregation, they talk about agents. But you're asking a good question, which is like, what is the big picture? And the big picture for me is, can open source AI produce models that are on the frontier and competitive with what big tech is doing? That is the big question. We have some reason to believe that we can aggregate a lot of compute and maybe even more compute than big tech companies. For example, Bitcoin network is a really, really good example of that. But there's a big question of, can open source compete? And a lot of people in the traditional AI world don't think so. Ilya Sutskever has said as much publicly. Sam Altman have said it. They're obviously
a bit biased in their opinion there, of course, but
we can think about what their biases might be. But my bet is that decentralized AI will create a pipeline for the production of AI models that is fantastically more open. In other words, while most people in decentralized AI are thinking about, these particular sort of threads, what I'm thinking about in general is the fact that this is a space that is about moving the state of the art of AI itself such that AI can run on public decentralized networks. In other words, it's public goods.
Yeah, I think it's a great macro important view to baseline us. I want to get into the tech stack in a bit, in which kind of area do you think has the most potential and promise, and which areas are maybe a little hypey. But before we go there, I want to kind of maybe to start this, ground this in ETH Denver. We were both in the last week at ETH Denver. We saw like just side event after side events of AI agent events and AI crypto events, and this space is oozing with energy, excitement, capital, and hype. I've been trying to get my arms around the entire board of all the projects, and like it's hard to do. Like there are hundreds or thousands of these decentralized AI projects. What, Jake, before we get into particular verticals, there's so much out there. What separates, as an investor, from your perspective, what separates a legit decentralized AI project from one that's riding the hype? What are some things you look at to sniff out green flags versus, okay, this is a AI flavored wand they're waving?
That's a really good question. I think profile and ethos, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So profile that I tend to look for and we tend to invest in is people who are actually in AI or have AI experience, coming to Web3, realizing, hey, we can take some of these primitives and create, products, services, research, advancement, etc., that is competitive with the Web2 world. And I want the customers of these products also to be, not just Web3, ideally Web2 customers as well, because then we're going to be showing...
Eventually they'll have to be, right? If the audience is only Web3, we're in big trouble.
Absolutely. We could take a look at inference as an example, right? So inference is probably one of the major categories of investment in Web3 AI. But if you start to think about inference, it's a little bit counterintuitive. If you want to sell inference to Web2 customers, probably one of the main considerations is going to be the cost, right? There's a lot of inference out there. There's a lot of compute out there. There's a lot of services that are providing, open and proprietary inference of LLMs and other AI models. There's the OpenAI API, there's Midjourney, there's all kinds of APIs out there that are competing with each other in a couple of domains. And a lot of it is about cost, right? So sure. you want to have the biggest model, the best model for the lowest price. You could see that in the competition between, OpenAI Deep Research and Grok Deep Search, right? So, but then when you go back to the kind of inference that happens on a decentralized network, as some people have proposed, you realize that actually this is not poised to be less expensive in most cases.
It's by design. It has a massive structural disadvantage in terms of co-compute and co-location compared to centralized training, right? So it's there's a handicap that has to be overcome to make it competitive on price.
That's right. So, and the handicap is essentially verifiability, privacy, maybe even some other infrastructural considerations that happen in Web3 networks that, generally speaking, do not make Web3 inference and decentralized networks cheaper than what you have in a centralized way. Now, there's projects that are trying to overcome that. It's very early, right? There's people working on basically sharded inference on commodity hardware. There's people that are looking at statistical methods for verifying, the fidelity of what comes out of an LLM. And these are all mechanisms that are trying really to bring down the cost of inference so it can be competitive, but we're not there yet. So anyway, that's an example of, again, looking for founders who have done pretty serious work in the traditional space and are using Web3 primitives to create an advantage.
Right.
Against
right.
Web2.
I think Ilya from Near comes to mind as Exhibit A, someone who was working on the foundational team at Google that helped birth the tech that launched the transformer and LLMs as we know it. So clearly he has impeccable AI, mainstream AI chops, and now is doing Web3 projects. So that's the profile. That's the profile component. So you mentioned ethos.
Yes,
right?
and
So what does ethos mean?
So I was getting there. Yeah. So, and by ethos, what I mean is kind of like the ethos of problem solving that's happening in this in this proposed company or project, right? I want to understand what are the core, very difficult technical problems at the heart of this sort of open pipeline of getting AI onto public decentralized networks. What are the really hard problems that we have to solve? And there's problems, inference in and of itself is not a hard problem. It's, hey, we set up some models and we set up a service to give their outputs. But in the course of solving something like, sharded inference on commodity hardware, you might be working with more difficult algorithms, or you might be advancing some distributed computing scheme. But where the area in which this really is illustrated very well for me is in the area of decentralized training, where I've been a pretty early investor.
Yep.
So decentralized training is something that seems very, very, very hard to do on a decentralized network. And the reason is because there's a number of limitations that come into play. There's
latency being a big one, if I'm not mistaken.
Latency is, yes, the fashionable one to sort of talk about. This refers to the latency between the nodes in a decentralized network that are trying to, fit this neural network model. But there's many other problems too. There's Byzantine resistance, there's fault tolerance, there's the question of, and I'll just say, so now we're in March of 2025. One of our portfolio companies, Prime Intellect, has demonstrated a number of models that have been trained on open decentralized networks today. So now we know that at least, to some degree, this is possible. A lot of people have, in the past have said this is not a problem worth working on. It's not really possible because of those latencies and so on. But it turns out that actually if you sit down and think about the properties of a training process that happens in such a network, and you ask yourself, like, what are these properties and how well researched are these properties? What you actually start to see is that there's a lot of greenfield research that is available and low-hanging actually can enable this. And Prime Intellect is one of the ways that you could do it using data parallel approaches. Our company Pluralis is now in the process of doing more advanced approaches that can scale to create even larger models.
We talked about green flags, and I love that ethos and profile framework. Let's flip the tables. Talk about red flags. I'm guessing there's a lot. I mean, as a journalist, Jake, I am getting shitloads of pitches left and right, and it is just so hard to sniff out what's substantive and what is Johnny-come-lately hype train. So I have my own. I'm working on my own kind of red flag detector. What's yours? What are some obvious red flags, and what kind of makes your bullshit meter really tick upwards?
Well, I mean, I don't know if even that's necessarily the framing that I would go with of some projects are real and some projects are bullshit. I just think that some projects have higher probabilities, right? And other projects might be kidding themselves about having a market, or just
that's true. I don't mean to imply it's just 90% bad actors trying to scam. That's not what I'm saying. I guess it's more okay. This is projects 417 of the projects all trying to do a similar thing, and they have the weakest team and the least legs to stand upon. So their intentions might be good, but this looks like a pretty shaky bet, right?
Yeah.
That's what
So red flags would be something like solving a very high competition kind of area or not very defensible problem, and thinking that you could still succeed but not actually having unfair advantages. So maybe let's make that concrete a little bit. So if you are doing a startup for, let's say, data labeling, right? You have to be really cognizant of where this data is going to flow into. And for data labeling, the majority customers of that kind of data today is probably big tech. It's probably Web2, people who are training larger models and require specialized data cleaning services. We have Scale.ai, which is multi-billion-dollar, very successful company, serving this niche in Web2. So if you're making the proposition that, okay, we're going to have data labeling, but in Web3, then we have to ask the question, who's going to be the customer of that?
Right.
Now, I just talked a lot about decentralized training, right? So in the future, there could be a market where models are trained in a decentralized way and decentralized networks are demanding this data, but that's not the state of the market today. And so, between a team today in this area where one team can pick up the phone and call Google, pick up the phone, call Facebook, pick up the phone and call Web2 customers, versus a team who's sitting in Web3 and sort of waiting for that market to materialize and mature, I would highly prefer the former. And so that would be a flag for me.
Makes sense. Back to the crux of this, what seems at least on the surface like a paradox we alluded to earlier, that so many projects are building open permissionless AI models, and classically VCs like defensibility and a moat. You mentioned there are a couple of examples of your portfolio companies that are starting to crack the code, but You can help me understand a little more about how that's possible. How is there confidence that a company will eventually have a proper profit model that delivers return for investors in this kind of very open ecosystem?
That's a great question. So let's start with the models that we sort of see in the market. You have very proprietary models. Those would be, OpenAI, Anthropic, Grok, etc. Users pay for these models, and then they get access, and their access will be like cut off if they stop paying. And also, their data, the data that flows through these systems is now owned by these companies.
Classic walled garden model, right?
Classic Web2, say model. And that is great, but one of the risks in that space is that you see like there's a very vicious race for the frontier model, for like huge funding for data centers. Some people are, starting nuclear reactors to feed their data centers and so on and so forth. Then you go into the Web2 model, but now that's focused on open models. And that would be a company, for example, Stability AI, or maybe Mistral as well. And what you see there is that or actually Meta, the Llama series.
Even Llama could fit in that lane, right? I would think, right? Yeah.
Now, having these models has been absolutely fantastic. This is open source. It allows developers and users to play with the models. There's been a whole lot of innovation where people have modified these models, learn how they worked. Now you can run kind of image generation on your MacBook Pro. There's even been training frameworks and fine-tuning frameworks that have been developed because, these things have been open. What do we mean by open there? We mean that, Mark Zuckerberg trains a big Llama model and he open sources the weights of the model. This is a giant matrix. It's a bunch of numbers, and we call that open source. Now, what's definitely true is that Mark Zuckerberg also goes on podcasts and says, hey, if it ever became expedient for us to monetize a closed proprietary model, we would absolutely not open source it at that point. So this open source it's very unsustainable. It's very provisional. And what it also doesn't do is it doesn't open some very important issues about model making, which is, what is the data that this thing has been trained on? What is the hardware setup? What is the architecture of the model? And so on and so forth. So it becomes an interesting thought that if you created a network, which is an open network, where you could create open models, but they were open in the sense of their setup versus in the sense of their weights, then I guess like what I'm saying is models with closed weights and open setup are going to be more open than models with open weights and closed setup like we have from Meta.
But it isn't much of the Web3 decentralized AI ethos to open all of it, to have the transparency on both the weights and the setup. And I'm still, and I take your point that the Llama bucket, if you will, of like open-ish AI that's not fully open. I take your point that that's not that open, really. But I'm still struggling to see how the more open and more decentralized and transparent Web3 AI solutions, to put it overly simplistically, how they make money. Where for an investor, where does the profit come into the play eventually?
Yeah. So in this model that I'm proposing, where you have open setup but closed weights, we have a business model, because if you can have the term of art is non-extractability of weights. If you can have non-extractability of weights, then these models have a business model in inference. Like some community gets together, they form capital, they train this model. This model is particularly good at a certain thing, or maybe it's the best LLM in the world. And suddenly people have demand for this model. Well, now they have to go back to this open network that trained it in order to do the inference, in order to receive the outputs of this model. And they're willing to pay for that, just like they're willing to pay for the OpenAI API and Anthropic and Grok and so on and so forth. However, what this system maintains is the same property that you have on GitHub, I can go and one-click fork a GitHub repository and it's free.
Sure.
And the same thing is I can go and fork the model setup, presumably in such a network, but then I have to get my own resources to train the model, right? So it's the same thing as, if I fork a popular project on GitHub, I own the code now, but I don't have the attention.
That's true. And to your point, there are plenty of examples, even in the Web 2 world, where open source tech is a big chunk of what a project is doing, but there's additional layers on top of that have more proprietary savvy that can then be monetized.
So this setup really solves two key problems. It solves the sustainability of open source. Historically, open source is not very sustainable. It doesn't have good business models. It relies on donations. It's not as people who work at open source are not necessarily competitively compensated, but it also solves the totally closed and proprietary and almost like dangerous nature of models that are trained in the secrecy, of big companies. So, I think it's an incredibly interesting idea.
Love it. And that's really helpful. Thank you. Let's get a little more specific now on the different layers of the stack here and what excites you most. And we talked a bit about this off mic way back when in Bangkok at DevCon, kind of like what most fires you up and what do you think most folks are going to be undervaluing between the, starting from the most, like whether it's we're going to start with the data layer or the training layer all the way through apps and agents. What right now do you think has the most potential and what excites you the most?
Well, I would say as a general matter, right, I think we very clearly see that in Web3, the topic of AI has become a huge topic and it takes up like a ton of mind share. I mean, we had the top crypto influencer this year for many weeks be an AI agent, right? I'm referring to AI XBT, which is meant to surface like crypto alpha on Twitter or X.
Yep.
So it's safe to say that AI is a hot topic.
Jake, I feel like every crypto conference has become a default or de facto crypto AI conference. And there's so many more events that have an AI tinge to them at the very least.
Absolutely. And the other thing I'll say about that is, if you look at it from the perspective of a normal person who's interested in AI, wants to get financial exposure, wants to invest in some frontier AI projects, well, you notice that, there's not really a ton of stocks on the stock market, in fact, any, that give you access to the most up-to-date frontier AI. OpenAI is not a public company. Anthropic is not a public company.
And NVIDIA isn't exactly cheap these days.
NVIDIA is not cheap, and I guess you could buy Google, but then you're buying exposure to, all the other businesses that they have there, not necessarily just AI. And are they, frontier competitive anyway? Maybe that's up for debate. So no public companies. Not really, most people are not going to access the private rounds of OpenAI. Now they're in the hundreds of billions. So how do people, if they want to invest in the space, how do they do it? Well, it turns out the lowest friction asset class is crypto.
That's an amazing, I hadn't thought about normies coming into this niche for undiluted investing access to AI in the token Web3 arena. That's interesting.
Absolutely. And I think that's why we saw some of this like AI meme coin exuberance earlier this year and late last year. Unfortunately, this is because there's all this pent up demand for like frontier AI exposure. But unfortunately, I think most of those tokens didn't really give exposure to the real Web3 innovation that's going on. And this is why I have DAI Summer 2025 in my Twitter handle.
Saw that, love it.
Thanks, because I really think that 2025 is going to be the year when people in traditional AI will start to realize that a lot of the Web3 AI, like research and problem solving, is very, very applicable to AI broadly. And they're going to get really interested in it. There's going to be papers published at ICML. There's going to be convergence. And there's going to be a lot of people buying crypto AI tokens.
Let's go there now. I do want to put a bookmark in the different kind of layers of the stack that fire you up. But one question I've been meaning to ask you, and I'm curious about, is why we don't see more folks in the traditional / centralized AI worlds exploring these decentralized Web3 solutions. And just maybe to step one level back, I've written plenty about this. I've written for CoinDesk a bunch of articles on crypto AI intersection, starting from a couple of years ago when it was still just an early idea for most folks. And the rallying cry has often been, well, we all know crypto needs AI and AI needs crypto. These are two technologies that fit perfectly, right? So I love that idea. I am wondering, though, if that is true, why, like, if you ask, and I talk to folks in the just more normcore AI world all the time, a very small percentage of them, at least in my experience, are saying, oh yeah, we need to be incorporating blockchain solutions. We need token frameworks. We need to embrace the power of Web3. That's a pretty tiny pie slice of folks in the larger AI world that think that. Why do you think that is? Why aren't there more folks? How do you reconcile that?
I'll give you my take on it for sure. I think the reason that you're seeing that is because there's really what's happening here is a convergence of two different communities. It's a cultural issue. So you have one community, and of course I'm referring to AI, the AI industry and research world, right? And kind of commercial world. This AI over here has been developing for 80 years or something. And these are some of the most traditional academic people who are coming from extremely centralized environments. They all come out of universities and big tech companies because historically this is where this research has been done. Pedigree is so important. What lab you worked at, out of college is an incredible predictor of future success in AI, right? Just a very, centralized sort of traditionalist mindset. And now, in a phase where they're making tremendous progress, we've invented the transformer. We see the scaling hypothesis sort of playing out. They're extremely focused on, figuring out how to win the AI race, figuring out how to get to AGI. What they're not thinking about is what to them seems like really auxiliary problems with a lot of headaches, by the way, that would occur if you were to try to start doing this in Web3. It seems totally superfluous. And on the other hand, you have, the Web3 community. This is a technology that's been around for 10 to 15 years. It's constantly trying to apply itself to different areas, banking, digital collectibles, now AI. And it's always coming with this decentralization requirement that's making it kind of difficult to navigate, opaque, technical. And again, now, all that being said is that there's also not zero people on the intersection of AI and Web3 who are very credible. We always talk about Ilya being one of the original authors. We talk about Imad, who was a crypto founder before starting Stability AI and now working on other projects, and so on and so forth. But I think, again, what I'd like anyone from those communities to take away from this podcast is that convergence is happening in a big way. And the overlap of problems is actually very, very large. And that is going to become obvious this year as I think decentralized training algorithms start to produce larger and larger and larger models and eventually, I think, compete with what the big tech guys are doing.
I totally agree, by the way. Let's go back, though, to the stack. I do want to get a little more clarification on when you look at this from compute, storage, model training, data marketplaces, AI agents, what are some corners or niches that you think that excites you and or are not enough folks are talking about, people are sleeping on?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of talk about AI agents. If you sort of,
the talk is everywhere. Yes.
I mean, if you look at the state of the art, such things, if you play around with Operator or deep research, what is obvious is that these things are very early, right? It's, you can't actually set Operator to go and do something for you and not expect to handhold it a lot, not expect it to get, into some kind of loop or make a mistake. I know I was doing some tax work and it started I gave it access to my Google Sheets, and it started opening up like other.
Sir, you're a courageous man. Yeah. AI agent, do my taxes. That's a low stakes. Let's start with something low stakes. My taxes.
Exactly. I mean, if you're gonna have AI agents that are your assistant, like they better be capable of doing the actual work.
That is the kind of thing that down the road, if this all plays out the way we want, you're right. That should be in scope. Yeah.
So I could tell you, like, personal experience, we're just not there. And so I think a lot of the Web3 AI agent stuff is very speculative. Mm-hmm. And what you see is that it's classified into a few different areas. We've seen a lot of AI influencer agents. Mm-hmm. That's pretty cool, but generally has a kind of a crappy business model. They tend to have a meme coin. A lot of meme coins go to zero, and so on and so forth. Then I mentioned AXPT, we've seen more like domain expert agents with a terminal, like AXPT knows about all kinds of crypto sentiment from Twitter. You could ask it questions about projects. You could even, pull up some data in as far as that data has been sort of highlighted on the platform. Mm-hmm. And that's useful and has a better business model, potentially with, subscriptions or, the way that AXPT is today, you have to hold a certain amount of token to use the terminal. But that's also not like the most exciting business model. And I feel like it's also not the most sustainable one because obviously agents who are ingesting more and better and cleaner data, they're going to like outperform AIXPT if AIXPT isn't catching up to those things. So there's always this like race in domain experts to be like the best domain expert and to maintain like the value, of the subscription. But I'll tell you the third category, which I'm most excited about, which is on-chain useful kind of DeFi agents. So one example of this is we have a portfolio company called GizaTech.xyz, and they've been they just launched Arma, which is an agent that helps you optimize your yield across different, vaults that are available. Mm-hmm. And, in the future, you could see these agents doing useful things, rolling your perps, making some kind of like risk assessment on financial transactions that you're doing and so on. And I think what's really interesting about the useful agent, there's a few things about Giza that's really interesting. First of all, they're completely zero knowledge verified. Like if your agent is handling your money, you definitely want some security guarantees. You want some correctness guarantees. You want to make sure you're inferencing the right model. You want to make sure that the inference has been done correctly. You can't just trust people on a Web3 open network, naively with that task because you will lose money, right? And so you need these stronger security guarantees. And the other thing that's really interesting, the business model rocks because the business model is the entire volume of DeFi volume, right? And so these agents can take a convenience fee on running through, some of these operations. Like for example, if it's optimizing your yield, it might be taking a little bit of a carry on that yield. But overall, you're getting a great result and a better yield that you would be getting by yourself.
I'm totally aligned with that and being bullish on that overall concept of using agents in this kind of DeFi land because some of the biggest knocks about DeFi and smart contracts more broadly is it can be super technical, be super manual and mechanical to do all these things. But AI's agents don't need a lot of, you can train them and they don't care if things are complicated. They don't care if it takes 37 steps to do these things. They can do that in 0.001 seconds, right? So the idea of having AI, I'm speaking a little loosey-goosey here, but elegantly orchestrate this world of smart contracts makes total sense to me. And I think that's one area where there is a massive advantage in combining the best qualities of Web3 with what AI is really good at as well. So totally agree.
And look, I think like for me, I like that useful agent framework more than all the other AI agents that have been proposed. Right? To me, like an agent is someone who is doing things on my behalf, like really doing them and also doing them in parallel to me, which increases my productivity. And again, I don't think we're there yet. I don't think most agents are capable. I think they're capable of like niche things right now.
Yeah.
Hey, give me some data, run a report on real estate in Miami, maybe optimize my yield in DeFi, but what you really want is sort of a generalist assistant, that does whatever you need it to do, and you could trust to do it as well.
I just made a very bullish comments. I'm going to now be annoying and make a skeptical comment or / question I'd love your thoughts on. While I completely see the merit and use case of agents talking to other agents, and you have this kind of blossoming agents to agents economy, the idea of having these constant, like high volume microtransactions and using some kind of cryptocurrency, God knows what it will be, but some kind of token solution in the DeFi universe makes sense. Got it. What I am a little skeptical about is when this topic first gained a lot of excitement a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, the kind of almost people tended to state almost as a bedrock principle or statement of facts. Well, clearly AI agents will be working on your behalf to spend money. Like maybe it'll book you a flight. It'll say, hey, buy me a ticket. I want to go to Tokyo on these dates. Find me the best flight, book me the hotel, do all the work, and then execute it on my behalf, make this happen. And the argument or the thought is, given AI agents are digitally native, it makes sense they would use the digitally native currency, which is cryptocurrency. That's just logical, and almost like a priori idea. My question, long-winded way of saying, my question is, in the DeFi world, yes, but in the more Web2 quote legacy world, but which is frankly still most of the world, if I'm using my agent to buy a ticket to Tokyo, is United Airlines, when they're setting up their infrastructure to deal with all this, are they more likely to be play ball with AI agents that is using some kind of cryptocurrency, or an AI agent who is just using a credit card, right? I guess the simpler question is, why can't AI agents, when interacting with like traditional companies, just use credit cards and you sync it up to your banking accounts and whatever, all that stuff. Like I'm not sure I see why necessarily TradFi has to be ebbed out if AI agents scale up.
I think AI agents will need to support credit cards realistically to interact with things in the real world. And also, I also think that, crypto is the most sensible kind of substrate for agentic commerce. We should be encouraging agents to move money this way versus like a bank or something.
Agreed.
I can't even imagine the complexity of setting up an account for an agent. But here's where, Jeff, I feel pretty confident is, we really if you zoom out from agents a little bit and onto the crypto world, we're really like in a period of convergence, again, between TradFi and DeFi. I mean, this is like one of the hottest topics. Yeah. You're seeing stablecoin legislation on the horizon. You're seeing banks starting to adopt or thinking about starting to adopt public blockchains and stablecoin payments. And you're seeing a lot of neobanks in the market sort of saying, look, we can have a combination of, traditional banking compliance and traditional wire services. But look, if you want to use stablecoin payments, if you want to use like DeFi for borrower lending, you now have these new primitives. And that bringing DeFi to market is really exciting. And also, I think accounts like that could be used with agents to cover the entire gamut of payment use cases that agents might run into.
That's a great point. There are some broader tailwinds for the space at large that will hopefully remove some of that friction, which leads me to my next question about regulation. Obviously, you mentioned stablecoin regulation. I feel like the regulatory bodies, or my just guesses from the cheap seats here, are so far behind grappling with these issues, right? They're just starting to get their arms around finally like stablecoins, and now we're talking about this potential billions of AI agents constantly flinging cryptocurrency tokens back and forth. Like, I don't think your average congressperson that's on their radar at all, right? Do you think that where's your head at as far as if and when regulation will quote enter the chat when it comes to crypto plus AI, and how do you think that will shake out when it does?
So I'm going to go and disagree with some of your assumptions.
Please.
I actually think that Congress has been getting like very rapidly up to speed over the last 3 years on frontier technologies like crypto and probably more recently AI as well. And what is so interesting about like these two pieces of legislation that are crypto related that everyone thinks will be very likely to happen in the next 2 year time frame is that they're all like bipartisan bills, right? They like it didn't,
as they should be. There should not be a political issue. It really shouldn't be. Yeah,
as they should be. And well, I guess what I'm saying is like it wouldn't have mattered who won the election to the extent that I still think these bills would be likely to pass eventually.
Yeah.
So there's that. And sorry, and your broader question was just kind of like, what's the regulatory?
Yeah. Well, how do you? I guess the subtext behind it is: are we proceeding? Are we excited about the space?
Yeah.
In a world that without really regulation looming on the horizon, but in 2 or 3 years, in my simplistic view of things, which maybe is misguided, if Congress wakes up, holy shit, like what are you guys talking about with billions of agents doing all this? Is that going to cast a shadow in the same way 3 to 5 years ago, the Web3 landscape was like, oh, took a big step back in regulation?
I think you're pointing to, an issue that always happens with technology, which is it runs ahead of government and regulators. And what's interesting living through our time is that, we're on this exponential curve of innovation where this technology is moving just exceptionally fast. If you think about how AI models come to market and then 3 days later there's a new and better one, and 5 days later there's a new and better one. This is literally the time scales of what we're dealing with. So what's going to happen when, there's a massive step change breakthrough that happens like on this very short time frame and changes everything. So that's definitely a challenge. On the other hand, like looking at crypto, I mean, we went from, in 10 years, right, we went from just absolute zero on regs to an administration that's touting crypto, our first crypto president, if you will, extremely favorable regulators in the SEC, CFTC, Treasury, other regulators. You have 2 pieces of legislation, as we keep saying, like looming in the horizon. You have a crypto task force at the SEC. You have a crypto czar in the White House. You have the president literally launching tokens for better or worse. And, it's really the best sort of regulatory environment that crypto's ever seen. And what this is actually going to enable, to me anyway, is just more institutional enterprise adoption. And that's the leg of adoption that hasn't been able to proceed in blockchain for so many years because of lack of regulatory clarity. And I think we need consumer adoption and enterprise adoption to sort of play off each other to really bring blockchains mainstream. So I'm really here for that.
Love it. Last couple of questions as we wind down. First, I know that many listeners of this pod, I'm guessing, are building in the space, are founders, are working on projects in crypto plus AI or decentralized AI, whatever you want to call it. What advice do you have for them? For advice to teams that are maybe looking for capital or wondering when to get capital? What's your kind of what words of wisdom do you have?
Again, I mentioned some of the profiles we're looking for. You should have great team composition. You should have experience in your field. I'm one of the wisdoms of, I guess, being an early stage investor over time is that you see that a lot of companies are really killed by timing. Like some companies are too early. Other companies launch at a wrong time and then fall into a bear market that's too long and aren't able to raise and go out of business. Right. So, one of the most important considerations and some of the most successful companies that are in our industry, have really gotten there by making very, very good use of timing. So if you're, squarely in, Web3 inference or Web3 AI agents, you should be asking how do you see this timing playing out? How do you see Web2 competition and agents, let's say, interacting with you? What are going to be the main issues that are going to make one agent product more successful than another agent product? For example, Google and Facebook and Amazon already have all your zero-party data. So if they're making useful agents, those agents are already in a position to be a little bit more personalized than something that you get in Web3. So look, we look for the top founders who are like, we are thesis and trend driven. So we're looking for them to fit into the trends that we're seeing. We look to support the best teams there. And every once in a while, a team comes along who changes how we think about those trends, how we think about our assumptions, right? And that happens more rarely, but it's also more rewarding.
Love that. It's great advice. Final question for you. Give us a couple predictions. I love a prediction on two different time horizons. One on the end of, was it hot? What was it, the summer? Your hashtag you're popularizing the hot DAI summit,
DAI summer 2025. Yeah.
Okay, great. So at the end of, so we finished the summer. We're in fall of 2025 or winter. What's different? Give us, what's changed as a result of this kind of fruitful summer. And then second time horizon for you. Let's go wild. 5 years out. What's the DA? Yeah, I know that's absurd, but let's have some fun with it. No one's gonna hold you to this 5 years from now. What do you think? What a prediction or two from that time horizon in the DAI world?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think so. The short term prediction for me would be, again, I think AI will do like really, really, really well this year, and of course, I mean Web3 AI. I think we're gonna see a lot of papers published at ICML. We're seeing companies like Prime Intellect and Jensen starting to launch products. We're going to see frontier research in AI coming out of Web3. I think we still see a lot of interest in AI kind of exposure through tokens. And of course, there's all the companies that are doing these other strategies around GPU aggregation, inference, data, all kinds of verticals in AI Web3. So I think like on a 12-month time frame, regardless of whatever else happens in crypto, I just think like the Web3 AI world we'll see like a nice market there. And then on a 5-year time frame, I mean, this is like a million years in blockchain time, but
I know. That's why it's fun.
But I like predictions that say, based on our past experiences with things changing quickly, I think we're going to see some assets in, let's call it the top 10, that are very, very surprising and
spicy.
I remember like in 2017 at the Token Summit, my original co-founder at CoinFund, Alex Bulkin, was asked to make a bold prediction, and he said, in like 5 to 7 years time, the top 10 will be completely different. And he wasn't right, but he was right like 7 out of the 10.
Yeah, absolutely. To expect the unexpected is a good note, I think, to end on. Jake, thank you so much, man. Really, really enjoyed this. You're always a voice that I love listening to bring some clarity to a very complicated space. Thanks for taking time. Best of luck to you in the fun. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate that, Jeff. Thank you for having me.
Well, there you have it. Thanks again to Jake Brukhman, founder and CEO of CoinFund. And thank you to my partner, Vana. When you look at Jake's earlier investment test of ethos and profile, I personally think Vana passes with flying colors, given the very real problem trying to tackle, a vision of user-owned AI through user-owned data, and a mission of being the world's first open protocol for data sovereignty. And thank you finally to you, dear listener. The People's AI is brand new. We are just launching, so please help us spread the word. Subscribe on the usual podcast platforms, including YouTube, post on social, all that good stuff. Thanks again, and see you next time.